Hi everyone, this is Kenna Magana, one of the District Instructional Specialists for ELA, and today we're going to have our second session of having a writing revolution in your classroom. So why writing revolution? This method, also referred to as the Hockman method, is rooted in research. It aligns to the instructional shifts in ELA that we've been talking about for the past few years. It builds students' comprehension by beginning with grammar basics, and you can apply this to any content area at any grade level. The Hockman method begins with the sentence. We know the sentence is the basic building block of writing. Then it progresses to outlines, paragraphs, and eventually full compositions. But it all starts with the sentence. So let's dive into today's session. So why would we teach sentence fragments? Teaching sentence fragments teaches the concept of complete sentences and how to discern sentence boundaries. This is really important. As a middle school teacher, I saw that even some students in middle school were struggling with this. So this is something that can be applied to any grade level. It also provides practice with capitalization, punctuation, spelling, and vocabulary. It serves as a comprehension check because we're not doing this in isolation. It's being done within our content that we're learning. And it helps students understand the meanings of subjects, predicates, and prepositional phrases. So let's take a look at these three sentence fragments. The little birds shuts the lid, receives a check. I want you to notice within these three sentence fragments, proper capitalization is not used in these. That's really important because if we're checking to see if they understand about proper capitalization and punctuation, we would want to make sure that we're not including that in the fragments that we're giving our students. We need them to show us what they know. So after I've taught my students about identifying and converting sentence fragments, this might be a sample lesson or a sample activity that I give them to check for their understanding. So let's say I was a social studies teacher and I'd been going over political maps with my students. I wanted to check to see what they understood about those political maps. So I would provide them with these sentences and sentence fragments, and I would have them tell me first whether it's a fragment or a sentence, and then I would want them to write it correctly. So you'll see number one, it simply says a political map, so that's a fragment. That could be corrected to a political map features cities, capitals, and borders. If you look down at number 3, that's an example where I've given my students a sentence, but you notice I don't start that sentence with a capital letter and I do not add punctuation at the end. I don't want to give them any hints. I truly want to see what they know. Here's an example from our 3rd grade unit, Cajun Folktales. After the students read this story, they may take these sentences and fragments and just check their students' understanding of what's going on. This is actually something that can be done with an image. So if you give your students this image or any image and provide them with with fragments and sentences and ask them to identify whether it is a fragment or a complete sentence, and then convert that into what it should be. The biggest teacher tip I have for you, the biggest one, you need to always anticipate your students' responses. You have to be prepared. This is not a plug and play. You cannot just come in and shoot from the hip and come up with these. You could, sometimes they might be right, but sometimes they might not be. So you need to be prepared by creating an anticipated student response page. That's going to help you ensure that your content is appropriate. It's going to make sure that you are providing them with an appropriate fragment or that you are providing them with a sentence, or to make sure that you're truly checking the student's comprehension. It's not just a sentence that they can go in and fill in the blanks from what they read. Like word for word, go to the text and word for word find that sentence. So when you're teaching with the fragments, It's best to begin with the subjects and predicates. Those are easier for students to master, and it's better when we're first introducing this to start with something easier for them to master, to get their confidence up, and also because these are very important parts of sentences. And then you'll want to hold off at the beginning on prepositional phrases and dependent clauses. Eventually, that's something that you can add in, but I do not recommend that you start with those. And again, begin with the end in mind. Always work backwards from your anticipated student response. You need to make sure there's alignment in between your lesson and the measure that you're using to assess them. You need to make sure that there is clear alignment between those. So if you're working backwards from your anticipated student response, you'll be able to see that the alignment is present and that your students are able to show you what they've learned in your lesson. So now let's talk about sentence combining. This is probably my favorite part of the Hockman method. So why would we even teach sentence combining? This teaches grammar and usage. It encourages more complex sentences and gives students various options for crafting sentences. So here's an example of two sentences that I may give my students based off of what we've read. Elizabeth Keckley moved to Washington, D.C. Elizabeth Keckley hoped to work in the White House. Now, in my anticipated student response, I'm anticipating the responses I want to see from my students. So these are two possible examples of the work that my students could give me. Elizabeth Keckley moved to Washington, D.C. because she hoped to work in the White House. Or, since Elizabeth Keckley hoped to work in the White House, she moved to Washington, D.C. Here's another example of sentence combining. In this example, I've actually told my students, I want you to write me 3 separate sentences where you're combining these 3 sentences at the top, but I want you to use the word so in one of those 3 sentences. I want you to use because in another one, and I want you to use since in the third. So you're giving your students some structure and guidance on how you want them to compose those sentences. When we're talking to our students about moving to more complex sentences, so doing that sentence combining, we need to give them 2 declarative sentences. You need to ask them to analyze those 2 sentences and identify what can be removed and then how they can be combined. So if you were in my class and I gave you these 2 sentences, Peter saw that it rained, Peter put on his rain boots, and I would say, okay, class, we're going to take these 2 sentences and we are going to rework them and put them together to one super sentence. What can we take out of these 2 sentences to make them one? Once I get my students' responses, I'm going to make sure I'm making notes either like in a Google Doc or on my active board. I want to make sure that all my students, whether they're virtual or in the classroom, they can see what's going on. And then after I get their responses, I would say, okay, so let me show you how we can put it together. Or I would maybe ask one of them to tell me how they would put it together, depending on whether this was an introductory lesson or this was more additional practice. So this teaches grammar and usage, and it encourages our students to use more complex sentences. I know you're tired of seeing those little baby sentences in your students' composition. You want them to create these more complex sentences that show our students have a more complex understanding of what they've read and the topic that they're writing about. They can't do this if we don't practice this with them. Should this take all day? No, absolutely not. But taking a few minutes to work on this, you can see some huge improvements in your students' writing. And they'll see that if this is something that's important enough to you, for you to take time to teach them about, then it's something important enough for them to use. Here's another example for sentence combining. Peter saw that it had snowed. Peter put on his snowsuit. So I would tell my students, okay, we just worked on this other sentence. I have a sentence. I want you to try to put it together in 3 different ways. And you see, I didn't say to use so, because, or after. I'm not giving my students that. In the beginning, you may need to, or if you want to challenge their sentence combining to be more complex, you may want to give those words to them. So why teach sentence expansion? This anticipates what a reader needs to know, and it provides information. Again, it checks comprehension because we're not doing this in isolation. It teaches note-taking strategies, and it develops their ability to summarize, and it's used often in revision. If this is something that we're practicing a lot with our students, we should see this when they go to do revisions on their papers. If there's something that we're seeing, we're giving them some feedback on a rough draft, and it says, they have these 2 sentences back to back, and we see where they could combine those sentences. If we've talked to them about sentence expansion, if we've done some practice with sentence expansion, you can write on that rough draft, you can write, try using your sentence expansion tools here and see what they're able to come up with. So now let's talk about kernel sentences. You see these little teeny tiny short little sentences. The snow fell, cells divide, they fought. Well, these little teeny tiny sentences can be expanded to make some really awesome sentences, but we need to add some stuff to them. We would think about these question words: who, what, when, where, why, and how. We would give a couple of these question words to our students in addition to a kernel sentence, and have them create a truly beautiful sentence that is an expanded sentence. So here's an example. Let's say my students have been reading about pyramids, and I give them this kernel sentence: pyramids were built. Okay, it's a complete sentence, but it doesn't tell me much. I want to know more. So I would ask my students to tell me, when were pyramids built? Where were pyramids built? Why were they built? And then I would tell them to put that all together with their kernel sentence to make an expanded sentence. So this example would read, in ancient times, pyramids were built in Egypt to protect the body of a deceased pharaoh. So we took that little bitty sentence, pyramids were built, that didn't tell us much, and we created this more complex, expanded sentence that tells us more about the pyramids. And we're able to see, what did our students comprehend in their reading? So with sentence expansion, you want to start with when, where, and why. Hold off right now on who, what, and how. That's not saying later on you can't add those. However, those are more complex concepts that don't need to be thrown at our students at the very beginning. That's something that once they feel more comfortable, once they have more practice, more experience, once they're doing better with the when, where, and why, then we can begin adding those. So a sentence expansion asking how. She saves Wilbur's life. Well, who? Charlotte. How? By spinning words in web. So the expanded sentence would be, Charlotte saves Wilbur's life by spinning words in her web. That's a little bit more complex, and it's not something that we should expect our students to be able to do right at the very beginning. They need to have a little practice first. So here is a sentence expansion example, an anticipated response. So let's say my students were reading about an article about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and I wanted to give them a kernel sentence, and I wanted to give them some question words, and I wanted them to create an expanded sentence for me. So I gave them the sentence, or the kernel sentence: the city enacted reform. That's a complete sentence. However, it doesn't tell me much. It's not truly showing me, if a student were to write that, it's not showing me that they truly understood what they read. So I would ask them some questions. when, why, where, how. And I want you to notice something on this example. We always love our students to write in complete sentences, but we also need to teach them about note taking. So you see how by our question words, you see the dotted lines? The dotted lines should always indicate to our students that we don't expect them to put a complete sentence there. We want them to take notes. We want them to just write some words or some phrases. That's not where it's important for them to be writing complete sentences. Where I want to see that complete sentence writing is anywhere there is a full line. So here you see a full line, down here you see full lines. So anytime my students see that dotted line, that indicates to my students that they are just writing words or phrases. So the expanded sentence I anticipate my students putting together is in October 1911, after 145 people died in a factory fire and a massive protest, the leaders of New York City enacted reform. That's an example of what I might expect my students to show me. So some teacher tips with kernel sentences. You want to keep those sentences brief, 2 to 5 words. Keep it simple. Volcanoes erupt. It sank. The thief vanished. He questions it. The Senate approved it. We don't want to give our students too much. We want them to give us the bulk of the information, but we need to give them a little something to say, hey, tell me more about this, but in a way that's going to help improve their writing. So they're showing us what they understand while they're practicing improving their writing. So some sentence activity reminders. The activities should always be embedded in the content. We're never teaching this in isolation. We need to always anticipate student responses. Remember, I told you that is so important. You need to prepare for what you expect to see from your students. Provide lots of teacher demonstrations. Modeling is so important with this. Once you start doing this with your students at those beginning lessons of each of the different pieces of the Hockman method, you want to make sure you are modeling, not just once, not just twice. You're modeling. If this is something that you're working on over, 2 weeks, that first week, every single day, you need to be modeling that. And maybe even some into the second week if you're still having some students who are struggling. You need to provide lots of opportunities for whole class oral and written practice. So when we're doing it, when we're modeling, we can have some conversations and do some examples where we, as a whole class, we talk about this and we put some sentences together ourselves. And also, do not stop sentence activities during paragraph instruction. So once we move from sentences to paragraphs, we don't want to stop, because that's when we would bring in those more complex things where I told you to hold off on certain things at certain times. That's when you would bring that in. So your students are already showing you that they mastered this stuff. They're writing some dynamic paragraphs and they're really being rock stars. Now let's kick it up. Let's show some more. Let's introduce some more complex things, which are going to help our students more adequately express their understanding of what they've read through their writing. So what's next? Well, we've done sentences, we did fragments. Now we're going to move to the single paragraph outline. I'm sure you can guess what's after the single paragraph outline. We would go to the multi-paragraph outline, but our next video is going to be on the single paragraph outline. All of this information was created using information from the training in the summer of 2020 that I went through with the Writing Revolution. I highly recommend, if you're interested in doing this method in your classroom, that you invest in Judith Hockman's book, The Writing Revolution. It's available on Amazon and other e-retailers, and they do have it in some brick and mortar bookstores. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions, you can email me at kmagana@ebrschools.org. You can also follow me on Twitter at ELA Updates, and I look forward to seeing you at our next session. Y'all have a great day.